All right, welcome back to biology. My name is Mr. Kubuske. We're going to go on to section 2 of our ecology unit. We talked about exactly what is ecology, studying how biotic and abiotic factors affect an ecosystem, things like that. So today we're going to talk about what really drives ecology and what ecologists actually would study, which is what we call interdependence. Now, you might remember that word from the beginning of the year. We said that interdependence was when living things depend on one another for survival, and we said that was a characteristic of living things, so it's probably pretty important. So today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about interdependence, and I'm going to keep my handy biome globe here handy so that way we can reference it as we go. Okay, so before we can talk about interdependence and how things rely on each other, we need to talk about how things have a role in their environment. Everything has a role to play, whether you're an apex predator, meaning that you eat everything, or whether you're a producer, meaning that you make food from inorganic substances or inorganic sources. Okay, so everything kind of has a role to play, and if you don't have a role, or if somebody else has that role, you may get pushed out of that environment and may not be able to survive there. Okay, so we call that role that you play a niche. Everything has a niche. It's a specific range of conditions under which a species can survive and reproduce. Okay, now let me show you exactly what I mean by that. Up here in the top of the world, okay, we have cold conditions. Okay, so the animals up here, the roles that they play are going to have to do. Their survival is going to have more to do with being able to stay warm, and being able to eat lots of things in order to keep the fat on and things like that. Whereas maybe something down in like a rainforest area, their niche maybe isn't going to be as defined because food is so plentiful. So here it's a really straight line, like, okay, this eats this or this depends on this. Whereas here you may depend or be eaten by or eat lots of different things. Okay, so your niche is going to really depend on where you live and the resources available to you. Okay, now we say that your niche is determined by something called a limiting factor, and basically what that means is it's a thing or a resource in an ecosystem that's going to control how much of my species, how much of my population can survive. Okay, that's basically what a limiting factor is. It's exactly what the name sounds like. It could be abiotic, it could be biotic, but it's going to limit the size of your population. Okay, those could be things like food, shelter, water, predators, mates. All of those things could be considered limiting factors. Okay, so there's different types of limiting factors. There's one type called density independent factors, which mean that the population is limited no matter what size the population is. Okay, now these are usually going to be like major events that occur in an ecosystem. They're going to be like a wildfire or a hurricane. Okay, it doesn't matter whether I have 1,000 in my population or 1,000,000 in my population. A hurricane is going to affect my population. It could limit the size because it's going to take food away, or it may kill off some of them, or it's going to destroy shelters or something. Okay, so it really doesn't matter how big my population is. These factors are definitely going to play a role, whether it's drought again or wildfire, and how my species can survive and how many of my species can survive. Okay, density dependent factors then, they limit the population growth, but only when it reaches a certain size. So there's only so much food, and once you run out of that food, okay, well that's the max that we can have in our population. Okay, or there's this many predators, and since there's these many predators, that controls the size of my population. So if it's controlling the size of a population and it's keeping it inside a range, that's a density dependent factor. Okay, and you can see the examples I have written here: competition for resources, predators, toxic waste accumulation, especially in fish populations. The mercury in water. I don't know if you're aware of this, but they say you're not supposed to eat certain numbers of fish out of the Great Lakes within a month because of the mercury accumulation that they had, that when you eat them you get mercury in them. So these are the types of things, and again, it's going to depend on the size of your population, which is what's going to control, or what these factors are really going to control. Okay, so when there's not enough resources, we call that competition. Okay, now this could be competition between similar animals, like you can see the rams here butting heads, probably fighting over mates and territory. Or it could be competition between two different species in a community. Okay, I'm sure you guys have seen the YouTube video of the lion and the alligator fighting over the wildebeest, or the water buffalo, excuse me. So these alligators and lions, they're competing against one another for food. Okay, so it could be competition again, interspecies or intraspecies, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Okay. So the competitive exclusion principle says that no two species can occupy the same niche and the same habitat at the same time. So if I go back, okay, yes, the alligator or probably it was a crocodile actually, the alligator, crocodile, and the lion were competing for the same resource, but they don't sit in the same niche. Okay, lions are obviously predators on land. Okay, alligators, although they will come up onto land in order to do some hunting, they mostly hunt in the water. So they're still two different niches, even though there's some overlap between what they're trying to get to. Okay. So a good example of this is lions and tigers. If you remember back in evolution, we talked about how lions and tigers used to be the same animal. In fact, if I look at their faces and I look at their features, I can see a lot of structures, okay, homologous structures that are similar between the two. Okay, so why are they different now? Well, what has happened is that since they began to become two different species, one hunted more in jungles and one hunts more in like plains. Okay, the lions have actually driven the tigers out, so the lions now live here in Africa, and the tigers then live in Asia, in the Middle East, and some of those type places. Okay, so they have pushed one another away because they're fighting for the same resources. So usually what ends up happening is because you can't survive, you end up moving. If you remember talking about the Galapagos finches, that's another good example of competition, the competitive exclusion principle. Okay, so no two species can occupy the same niche, basically what it means. Okay. So here's another way that organisms can depend on one another. Okay, so how would a wolf population, okay, have an effect on a grass population? Why would that actually play a role? Okay, well, let's talk about that. Predation: predators affect the size of the prey populations in a community to determine the places that they can live or feed. Okay, so if I go back, wolves aren't predators on grass. Okay, so how are those still dependent on one another? Well, it has to do with predation, because remember, the predator is going to eat another type of consumer, something else that consumes that grass. And if we don't eat enough of them, then they may eat too much grass, and that could throw off the whole thing. Okay, so let's say we have an elk here that's eaten by this wolf. Okay, we call the wolf a keystone species because he keeps the elk population in check, meaning we're able to keep the ecosystem in balance. Okay, if you're not sure what a keystone is, the keystone is that weird-looking stone at the top of an archway that prevents the archway from caving in. We'll talk more about that in class. It's actually pretty interesting if you're into physics and stuff like that, but it's the only way that arches can work. You have to have that keystone in there. Okay, so if the wolf was taking out of this ecosystem, what would change? Well, the elk population would grow exponentially because there's no more predators to stop the growth of their population. But because their population grows exponentially, they eat too much food. So now the grasses will all disappear, and we'll have these dry, arid places. Okay? Now, without grasses to hold soil in place, the good, nice topsoil will disappear because of erosion of wind, and we'll be left with this dry, really, arid, no good for anything kind of land where grass can't grow. So if the grasses all die out, what happens to our elk population? Well, obviously they will die out too. So just eliminating that one species has completely thrown off that entire ecosystem. So we call the wolf population a keystone species because without it, everything else falls apart. Okay. So population size, we call population size, we say that they fit inside of something called a carrying capacity. It's the size that a population is maintained at. Okay. Now it can vary. Okay, but it usually stays within a range. Okay, and that's what our lab is going to be about tomorrow. We're going to talk about how populations can vary. If there's too many in a population, it can be harmful to the other organisms in the environment, and we just learned about how that is the case when we talked about the keystone species. Okay, so carrying capacity is controlled by limiting factors. Remember, predators are a limiting factor, food is a limiting factor, shelter mates, etc. Okay. Now, symbiosis. You've probably talked about symbiosis before, and there's a great video, but I don't have time to show it to you right now. But if you look up the symbiosis music video with the dancing hippo, it's hilarious. We'll watch it. I highly suggest going through and watching it. I'll put the link on my website. It's really creative, really clever. Okay, but basically, symbiosis is a long-term relationship between two species. Okay. Now, there's different types of symbiosis. Okay, it's a positive. If it's positive, meaning everybody benefits, we call that mutualism. Okay, a good example here would be the rhinos and the birds that sit on their back. The birds eat parasites off of the rhino's back, so the rhino is rid of parasites and the birds get food. Positive. Mutual benefits, mutualism. Okay, commensalism is a relationship where one organism benefits but the other doesn't get harmed or hurt from the relationship. Okay, when cows or bison go thundering through a grassland, okay, they're going to kick up bugs and other things that birds like to eat. So the birds will swoop in and eat up the bugs, okay? So they're dependent on these cows, but the cows or the bison don't get any benefit from the birds. So that would be commensalism. And then the last type of symbiotic relationship is called parasitism. That's a relationship where one benefits, the other is harmed. That's where the term parasite comes from, okay? Good example would be ticks, leeches, etc. Okay? So, I would like you to go use this website to go find a couple more examples besides the one that I gave you. It's always good to find different examples because it's going to help you remember when you go to talk more about these later on in the unit. Okay. A couple other ways that organisms depend on one another. We are dependent on producers. There's different types of producers, but basically a producer is something that makes its own energy. Another word for producer is autotroph because they make their own food. There's two different types of autotrophs. There's photoautotrophs, which if you just look at the name, you can probably figure out that they use photosynthesis to make their food. And then there's another type of autotroph called a chemoautotroph, which uses chemicals, usually some type of inorganic carbons, usually from deep sea vents. If you remember talking about the archaebacteria, some of the first life forms on the planet, when we talked about evolution, they were chemoautotrophs. They used the carbon from those deep sea vents in order to make energy for themselves. Okay, so photoautotrophs and chemoautotrophs. Okay, and then after producers, there are consumers. There's different types of consumers, but we call consumers heterotrophs. So we have autotrophs, which are producers, but consumers are called heterotrophs because they need others. They need different sources of food. They cannot make their own food. Okay. Again, now there's different types of consumers. There's herbivores, there's carnivores, there's omnivores, which eat both plants and animals. Okay, and then there's also one that gets lost a lot of times are detritivores. Okay, also known as decomposers. These are the ones that are going to break down dead plants and animals and then recycle their nutrients back into the environment. Okay, they're really important for ecosystems because they get rid of that waste that is not going to be beneficial to the environment. Okay, they usually cause a stink, literally. They put off gases, but it's usually a pretty good thing for the environment to have those decomposers there. Okay, so fungi and bacteria are good examples of detritivores. Okay, so in conclusion, what is a niche? Niche is the role that you play in your ecosystem, okay, or in your community. Excuse me. What happens if there's not enough resources? There's competition, okay, and then we learned about the competitive exclusion principle, where you'll be pushed out or you could go extinct, okay, and then how do organisms depend on each other? There's predator-prey relationships, there's symbiotic relationships, and those are just a couple of the different examples, okay. So, hope you learned something. I know we went over a lot. There's a lot of terms in this stuff, but again, it's pretty important stuff. But hope you learned something. Please go back, look at those links I told you about, add those to your notes. Have a great day.